John Carter stood in the first-class boarding line, his simple attire a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding him. Just a few steps away, a man observed him with a mix of curiosity and disdain, his arrogance barely concealed. What was about to happen would leave every passenger on that plane speechless, and completely change one man's perspective. JFK International Airport was as bustling as ever. The hum of conversation filled the air, blending with the rolling of suitcases across the floor, the distant echoes of flight announcements, and the hurried footsteps of last-minute travelers. Amidst all the chaos, one man stood still, calm, composed, and unassuming. That man was John Carter. He was dressed simply, a flannel shirt, faded jeans, and worn leather boots. A well-traveled backpack hung from his shoulder, bearing the signs of countless adventures. There was nothing flashy about him, no expensive watch, no designer brands, yet something about him made him impossible to ignore. Most passengers paid him no attention, but to those who looked closely, they could sense an unshakable calmness about him. Unlike the restless, impatient travelers around him, John exuded a quiet stillness, as if he wasn't in a rush like the rest of the world. He observed everything, not with urgency but with a quiet appreciation. Just behind him in line stood Nathan Sterling, the complete opposite of John. Everything about Nathan screamed status and success. His perfectly tailored navy suit, polished Italian leather shoes, and the expensive cologne that left a lingering presence wherever he walked. Every movement he made seemed calculated, as if he was used to being the center of attention wherever he went. Nathan's gaze swept across the boarding line until it landed on John. A smirk curled onto his lips as he leaned in slightly, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "First class, huh?" Nathan mused, his tone dripping with subtle condescension. "You never know who you'll run into these days." John tilted his head slightly, meeting Nathan's gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. "Yeah," he responded evenly. "Life is full of surprises." Nathan frowned slightly as if he had expected a different reaction. Perhaps he thought John would be flustered or defensive. But John remained completely unbothered, as if Nathan's words held no weight at all. That only made Nathan want to push further. With his signature smugness, Nathan let out a quiet chuckle. "Nothing personal," he continued, flashing a knowing grin, "but you don't exactly look like the type to fly first class. Or, maybe you're in the wrong cabin?" He let the words linger, then added with a smirk, "It's just rare to see someone so casual in this part of the plane." The arrogance in his voice was unmistakable. John, however, didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't waver. He simply nodded, letting Nathan's words hang in the air without protest. He had expected a different reaction, perhaps a hint of embarrassment, an awkward chuckle, something to confirm his assumptions about this man. But John remained completely unfazed, as if Nathan's words had no effect on him at all. Unwilling to let the conversation end there, Nathan pushed further. "Nothing personal," he said with a small smirk. "But you don't exactly look like someone who flies first class often. It's not every day you see someone this casual in this part of the plane." John didn't flinch. He simply gave a slight nod, his face betraying no emotion. Just then the boarding line began to move faster. The two men, without exchanging another word, stepped forward, their tickets in hand. Nathan walked with absolute confidence, the sound of his polished leather shoes echoing through the terminal floor, his stride radiating the authority of someone accustomed to privilege. Meanwhile, John walked at the same steady, unhurried pace as before, completely untouched by the rush and urgency around him. When they finally stepped onto the plane, Nathan glanced down, checking his ticket one last time. He moved toward his seat, then suddenly stopped. Seated right next to him was John. Nathan let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Of all the seats on this plane, it had to be this one. John, still as composed as ever, turned toward him with a polite, easy smile. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said evenly. Nathan crossed his arms and leaned back into his seat, trying to suppress the strange discomfort creeping over him. But it wasn't just the coincidence. It was John's presence. There was something about him that Nathan couldn't quite explain. Yet, somehow, it unsettled him. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to John, it was the realization that the very man he had judged only moments ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. Nathan couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about John's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the last of the economy passengers trickled in, Nathan decided to break the silence. But he wasn't looking for a friendly chat. He wanted to confirm his assumptions. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone casual, almost dismissive. It was the kind of question people asked when they thought they already knew the answer. John, who had been adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Nathan raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" John gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place in the world. But let's be honest, some spaces just aren't meant for everyone." He gestured vaguely around the first-class cabin. John studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable, then replied evenly, "I think we all have our place. And sometimes it's exactly where we are." Nathan let out a short laugh. "That's nice, philosophical even. But real life doesn't work that way." John didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned toward the window as if the conversation no longer interested him. But Nathan wasn't done. Leaning slightly toward him, he smirked. "You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places just don't really belong to certain people." This time, John didn't reply with words. Instead, he simply turned and looked at Nathan, his expression a quiet mix of patience and something else, something that made Nathan shift slightly in his seat. John's gaze held steady, a mix of patience and quiet firmness. It was the kind of look that spoke louder than any words ever could. Nathan, realizing that his attempt to provoke had fallen flat, leaned back in his seat with a smug smile. He thought he had won the exchange, convinced that he was in control. But the truth? This was only the beginning. Nathan had no idea that John's quiet demeanor concealed something he couldn't anticipate. With every passing moment, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. The plane had been in the air for some time when the in-flight service began. The flight attendant made her way through first class, offering drinks, and Nathan made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please," he said, flashing a confident smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant, accustomed to passengers like him, nodded with a polite but detached professionalism. Then she turned to John. "Just water, please." Nathan couldn't let the moment slip by. He let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Water?" he asked, almost laughing. "Come on, man. You're flying first class. Don't tell me you're gonna waste the experience on water." John took the bottle from the flight attendant and responded calmly, without hesitation. "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Nathan narrowed his eyes as if trying to decipher what John really meant. Then he smirked. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." John simply raised the bottle to his lips, taking a slow sip. He didn't react. But around them, other passengers had started to take notice. Other passengers began to notice Nathan's condescending tone, but since John appeared completely unbothered, no one intervened. Finally, John responded, his voice as calm as ever. "Maybe the best is different for everyone." Nathan's smirk faltered for a second. He took a deep breath, trying to keep control of the conversation. "Or maybe," he countered, tilting his head slightly, "people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are simply out of reach for certain people, you know?" A few seats away, the flight attendant, who had been serving another passenger, glanced discreetly in their direction. She considered stepping in, but something about the way John was handling the situation made her decide otherwise. John simply let out a quiet exhale and turned back toward the window, offering nothing more than a slight smile. Nathan, however, wasn't satisfied. He wanted a reaction. He had been so certain he was winning this exchange, but for the first time he was beginning to sense that John wasn't the type of person who could be easily rattled. Worse yet, Nathan's arrogance was starting to make the other passengers uncomfortable. To them, this wasn't a battle of wits, it was a man embarrassing himself without realizing it. Still he pressed on. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to their section, offering another round of drinks. Nathan took the opportunity to continue what he saw as a conversation. But in reality, it was nothing more than a string of provocations. He lifted his champagne glass slightly, swirling the golden liquid before speaking. You know, life is a lot like flying first class, he mused, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure others could hear. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, he shot a glance at John, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky. John slowly set his water bottle down on the tray in front of him and finally turned to face Nathan. His gaze was steady, calm, unshaken. But there was something else in it now, something that made Nathan hesitate. There was something different in John's expression now, a quiet shift, a readiness to respond more directly. He held Nathan's gaze, then spoke in a voice that was calm yet firm. Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? For the first time, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. Passengers who had been discreetly listening in now leaned in just a little closer. The air between them grew heavier, the tension palpable. Some exchanged subtle glances, realizing that this conversation had turned into something more than just idle chit-chat. Nathan forced a smile, though there was an undeniable flicker of discomfort in his eyes. John's words had landed in a way he hadn't expected. Well, Nathan said, adjusting his posture, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here. John leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the seat in front of him. His gaze remained steady as he gestured around the luxurious first-class cabin. I think the value of being here, he said evenly, isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others. The words hung in the air like an undeniable truth. A few passengers nodded subtly, while others exchanged approving glances. The shift in the cabin was noticeable. People were no longer just eavesdropping, they were taking sides. Nathan, on the other hand, squirmed slightly in his seat. He tried to brush it off with a forced chuckle, but his growing discomfort was evident. That's a good one, he said, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks. John didn't react. He simply gave a small, knowing smile and turned his attention back to the front of the cabin, effectively ending the conversation without another word. Yet somehow, his silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Passengers around them began to react in quiet, subtle ways. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others glanced at Nathan with disapproving expressions. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who had seemed to recognize John, remained silent, respecting his privacy. But their admiration for him was clear. Many passengers found themselves admiring the way John handled the situation, with grace, patience, and an unshakable confidence. Meanwhile, Nathan was beginning to notice something unsettling. He was being watched. And not in a good way. The confident posture he had carried at the beginning of this exchange began to waver ever so slightly. His smirk wasn't as sharp, his presence not as commanding. Yet, despite the shift in the air, he wasn't ready to admit defeat. Nathan still believed he was winning this dispute, convinced that he had the upper hand. But the truth? The reactions around him told a very different story. What he didn't yet realize was that he was moments away from questioning everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses, Nathan made one last push, determined to regain control of the conversation. You know what's funny? Nathan said, his voice laced with forced amusement. It's always the people who have nothing to show for themselves that go on and on about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that? John turned his head, his eyes locking onto Nathan's with quiet intensity. He leaned forward slightly and with a steady voice replied, I've noticed that the people who talk the most about what they have are usually the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words hit like a hammer. For a few seconds, Nathan just sat there, momentarily stunned. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by the way John had effortlessly dismantled the arrogance in front of him. Nathan, realizing the momentary lapse in his composure, recovered quickly. Look, I don't mean to be rude, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work. John leaned back in his seat, his expression as calm as ever. Maybe, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. The words hung heavy in the air. Passengers around them nodded subtly while Nathan, for the first time that flight, had nothing left to say. Around them the mood in first class had shifted. What had started as an insignificant exchange had now captivated the attention of nearly everyone in the cabin. Some passengers threw disapproving glances at Nathan. This was clearly a man used to being the one in control, but today that control was slipping. An older gentleman sitting a few seats away turned toward the conversation, observing more closely. As he did, he gave a small shake of his head, his expression making it clear he didn't approve of Nathan's behavior. Nathan, noticing the eyes on him, tried to suppress his growing irritation. But instead of backing down, he went for another jab. Cheap philosophy, he scoffed. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way. John turned to him, his expression as composed as ever. The real world is made by people, Nathan, he said evenly. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else. For the first time, Nathan was visibly unsettled. He glanced around, suddenly aware that the attention of the cabin was no longer in his favor. Some passengers whispered among themselves, while others stared at him directly, their expressions shifting between curiosity and quiet disapproval. Nathan had walked onto this plane believing he was the dominant force in every room he entered. Now he was beginning to realize something unsettling. He had lost control of the narrative. And worse, John hadn't even tried to take it from him. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Nathan crossed his arms, attempting to mask his discomfort, but his irritation was starting to show. Meanwhile, John remained unbothered, completely unfazed by the atmosphere around him. Then, with a quiet confidence that made the silence even heavier, he turned to Nathan and spoke. You know, Nathan, I understand what you're saying. The world can be competitive. He held his gaze for a moment before adding. But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper. Something deeper, John continued, his voice steady. An insecurity. An inner struggle. Nathan furrowed his brow, unsure whether this was a subtle jab or an attempt at genuine conversation. He let out a short, hollow laugh. Inner struggle? He scoffed. I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong. John gave a small, knowing smile and shook his head. Maybe. But I've met a lot of people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, though, they were just trying to fill something missing inside them. The words landed harder than Nathan expected. For a moment he didn't say anything. His fingers absent-mindedly twisted the wedding band on his hand, a flicker of something, doubt? Reflection? Crossing his face. But just as quickly he recovered, his voice regaining its defensive edge. That's not me. Everything I have, I worked for. And I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. John didn't react. He simply observed Nathan for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully before speaking again. I'm not saying you didn't work hard, he said, his voice calm, deliberate. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in showing off what we've achieved, that we forget to look inward. He paused, letting the words settle before asking. Who are we without all of this? Nathan's jaw tensed. For the first time he had no quick comeback. The question seemed to echo in his mind, striking something deep within him that he wasn't ready to confront. After a beat, he forced a cynical laugh. Who are we? He repeated, shaking his head. We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing. John held his gaze. This time his expression was more serious. I disagree, he said, his voice quieter but filled with conviction. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter far less than what we carry inside. He placed a hand over his chest as he spoke, the weight of his words resonating throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded subtly while Nathan, for the first time in a long time, felt unsure of himself. Nathan was struggling to maintain his composure. His frustration was boiling over, and it showed. That's easy for you to say, he snapped, his voice rising as he nearly pushed himself out of his seat. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here. John met his gaze, his expression unwavering. His voice remained firm but calm. You're right. I don't know your story, he acknowledged. But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when people feel the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something. He let the words settle for a moment before adding, fear, insecurity, loneliness, It was as if the words had been physically thrown at Nathan. He froze. His face flushed, with anger, with embarrassment, maybe even with something deeper. His fists clenched at his sides as he struggled to contain whatever storm was brewing inside him. And then he lost it. With a sharp motion, he shot to his feet, his empty champagne glass crashing to the floor, shattering on impact. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice ringing through the cabin. Every passenger fell silent. All eyes were on him now. "You sit there with your clever little phrases acting like you know everything about life," Nathan spat. "But you don't know a damn thing about what it's like to live in the real world." The tension in the air was suffocating. A flight attendant rushed forward, her expression concerned as she tried to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Meanwhile, John hadn't moved. He remained seated, watching Nathan with the same calmness he had carried from the start. He let Nathan's words hang in the air, not rushing to respond. And then, when the moment was right, he spoke. His voice was steady, firm yet gentle. "I don't think I'm better than you." He paused, his words measured. "I just think that sometimes, we need to stop and think about what really matters." His gaze held Nathan's, unwavering. "And Nathan, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." It was as if all the fight drained from Nathan in an instant. His chest rose and fell heavily, his breathing uneven, but something in John's words hit him differently this time. Slowly, as if all the energy had left him, Nathan lowered himself back into his seat. He didn't meet John's eyes anymore. He wasn't angry anymore. He just looked defeated. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. John's words still echoed in Nathan's mind, repeating over and over like a melody he couldn't turn off. For the first time in a long time, Nathan felt truly exposed. Vulnerable. And not just in front of one person, but in front of an entire room full of strangers. Yet, what he didn't realize was that the biggest revelation was still to come. The flight continued in an almost unbearable quiet. Nathan remained in his seat, staring straight ahead, avoiding John's gaze at all costs. But it was clear, his mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, John sat back, completely at ease. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Then, a short while later, the flight attendant approached John with a polite smile. Her voice carried just enough volume to catch the attention of the entire cabin. "Mr. Carter, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Los Angeles is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Carter seemed to ripple through first class. Passengers who had been quietly observing the exchange now widened their eyes. A murmur spread through the cabin as recognition set in. And that's when Nathan froze. His mouth parted slightly, his breath catching as he muttered, almost in disbelief. "Carter?" His gaze snapped toward John, his expression shifting from arrogance to pure shock. "John Carter?" John simply nodded, offering the flight attendant a polite thank you before turning back to face Nathan. He didn't seem fazed by the commotion. Nathan, on the other hand, looked like he had just seen a ghost. John studied him for a moment before asking, with an easy smile, "Something wrong, Nathan?" Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His mind raced as he glanced around, realizing that other passengers were watching him. Some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. He looked completely lost. His confidence, his ego, had all but vanished. He sank back into his seat, visibly uncomfortable. His hands fidgeted, his jaw clenched as he struggled to find the right words. I had no idea." He let out an awkward chuckle, his voice suddenly unsure. "I mean, you didn't say who you were." The words felt hollow even as he said them. "I didn't know that you were, you." John tilted his head slightly, still calm. And though his expression remained gentle, there was an unmistakable weight behind his next words. There was a quiet firmness in John's voice as he replied, "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Nathan sat there, silent for a moment, searching for a way to salvage what little dignity he had left. Finally, he attempted to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you," he stammered. I didn't know who I was talking to." John let out a quiet sigh, then leaned forward slightly. "Nathan, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name." His voice was calm but carried a weight that filled the cabin. "The truth isn't about who you're speaking to. It's about how you choose to treat people." The words landed like a hammer. Nathan's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, he had nothing to say. He looked from John to the passengers around them, suddenly aware of just how many people had been listening all along. Some had leaned in slightly, others simply watched, their gazes sharper than before. The humiliation on Nathan's face was undeniable. Then, after a long pause, John decided to end the conversation with a final lesson. "You know, Nathan," he said, "life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down just to make themselves feel bigger." Nathan swallowed hard, his shoulders subtly tensing. He gave a small nod, unable to argue. For the first time that flight, he looked like he was genuinely thinking about what had just happened. John leaned back in his seat, effectively closing the conversation without another word. Nathan, on the other hand, remained motionless, his eyes fixed on his hands as if he were replaying every word in his mind. Because this wasn't just a confrontation between him and John. It was a confrontation between him and reality. And the truth was unavoidable. In his desperate attempt to belittle someone else, Nathan had ended up revealing more about himself than he had ever intended. For the rest of the flight, a heavy silence filled the space around him. The man who once walked onto the plane like he owned the place, now sat there, visibly uncomfortable, shrinking under the weight of his own arrogance. And for the first time, he could barely meet the eyes of anyone around him. The arrogance Nathan had carried at the start of the flight was gone. In its place was something much closer to shame. As the minutes passed, he couldn't stop thinking about John's words. Everything he had said seemed so simple, and yet, it cut deeper than Nathan could have ever expected. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own behavior. How many times had he judged people without ever trying to understand them? How many times had he assumed that status and wealth were all that mattered? He let out a small breath, barely a whisper, as a thought crept into his mind. Maybe he's right. Without realizing it, his eyes flickered toward John. And there he was, sitting peacefully, flipping through the pages of a book as if nothing had happened. That, more than anything, made the impact of the moment even heavier. Because John hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to prove anything. He had simply let his actions speak for him. As the plane began its descent, Nathan knew he couldn't leave without saying something. Finally, mustered the courage, he turned toward John, his gaze still lowered. "I need to apologize," he said quietly. He hesitated before adding, "Not just because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." John looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology," he said simply. "But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Nathan nodded slowly, realizing that John's words weren't a dismissal, they were an opportunity. A chance to change. Then John continued, his voice as steady as ever. "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves." He held Nathan's gaze for a second longer before adding, "I hope you figure out what really matters." Nathan didn't respond. But John's words stayed with him. Because deep down he knew, this moment had the power to change something inside him. If he let it. After landing, Nathan stepped off the plane, still caught in his own thoughts. And then he stopped. Just ahead, he saw John moving through the terminal. A few people recognized him, approaching quietly, respectfully. And John? He greeted each one with patience, with kindness, with a genuine smile. Nathan watched him disappear into the crowd, a quiet realization settling over him. This was the kind of person he had tried to belittle. And yet, John Carter had never needed to prove anything to anyone. John moved through the terminal without haste, without arrogance. It was clear, his simplicity, his kindness, it all came from within. Nathan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping to his hands. He knew. He needed to change. John's words still echoed in his mind, a quiet but undeniable reminder that a person's true worth isn't measured by their status, but by how they choose to treat others. As John disappeared into the crowd, Nathan felt something unexpected. Oh, maybe this encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. Because in the end, we all carry choices that define us. Are we living to impress others? Or to become better people? John's words left behind a lesson that couldn't be ignored. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off. It's about the impact you leave on the world, and on the lives of those around you. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, arrogance, or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And maybe, the change you want to see in the world, has to start with you. The story of Nathan and John Carter is a clear illustration of the contrast between arrogance and humility, superficiality and true values. Nathan Sterling boarded the flight with a sense of entitlement and superiority, believing that status and wealth were the ultimate measures of a person's worth. He judged others based on appearance, assuming that those who didn't display luxury didn't deserve the same privileges he enjoyed. Instead of engaging in polite conversation, Nathan chose mockery and provocation, attempting to prove that he was above everyone else. In stark contrast, John Carter carried himself differently, with quiet confidence, composure, and no need for validation. John didn't react to Nathan's provocations with anger or arguments. Instead, he used simple but meaningful words, allowing Nathan to realize his own misconceptions. John didn't need to prove his worth through appearance or status. He let his actions and attitude speak for themselves. The climax of the story came when Nathan discovered that John was a renowned and successful individual, the very person he had looked down upon. This realization left him embarrassed and unsettled. But the true lesson wasn't about who John was, but rather about Nathan's mistake in judging people based on appearances. Life lessons. 1. A person's true worth isn't determined by wealth or status. Having material possessions doesn't equate to being truly rich in character. Humility, integrity, and how we treat others define our true value. 2. Arrogance can blind us to important lessons. Nathan believed he was in control of the situation, but in reality his arrogance made him look foolish in front of others. When we're too focused on proving ourselves, we may miss the valuable lessons life is trying to teach us. 3. True success doesn't need to be flaunted. John didn't need to boast or argue to defend himself. He let his demeanor, composure, and wisdom do the talking. A truly successful person doesn't need to announce their success, it speaks for itself. 4. How we treat others reflects who we are. John's profound statement, "The truth isn't about who you're speaking to, but about how you choose to treat them," holds true in all aspects of life. Kindness, respect, and empathy are never wasted. 5. There's always an opportunity for change. Even though Nathan started with arrogance, the story ended with him realizing his mistakes and considering change. This is a powerful message. Anyone can learn, grow, and become a better version of themselves. Backhand index pointing right. Conclusion. Don't let prejudice and ego cloud your judgment. Live with humility, compassion, and respect for others, because these are the true measures of your value in life. Speech balloon. What do you think about this story? Have you ever encountered someone like Nathan? Or perhaps at some point been a little like him yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Fire. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel, Soul Deep Stories. We bring you more inspiring tales every week, filled with life lessons, emotional depth, and thought-provoking messages. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change the way you see the world. Sparkles. Let's spread kindness, wisdom, and self-reflection, one story at a time. Red Heart.